Due to the graphic nature of this murder case, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes dramatizations and discussions of racism, anti-Semitism, hate crimes, murder, child murder, and sexual assault. We advise extreme caution for children under 13.
On September 10th, 1984, West Virginia State Trooper Debbie DeFalco sat hunched over a hand-drawn map. It was a mess of intersecting roads and childish handwriting, but a few words stood out to her: interstate, gas station, and most importantly, rainbow meeting.
The map belonged to an inmate at a federal prison in Illinois, a white supremacist serial killer named Joseph Paul Franklin. He said that he'd murdered the so-called Rainbow Girls, Nancy Santomero and Vicky Durian, during his multi-year crime spree, and he'd sketched the map as proof.
There were markings to show where Franklin picked up the two hitchhikers, the roads he took up into the mountains, and the spot where he allegedly left their bodies on June 25, 1980.
DeFalco's superiors were fairly certain that Franklin was delusional and that this was a false confession. But all of their other leads had fizzled out, so they sent her to Pocahontas County to check it out.
After briefly looking at the map on her own, DeFalco showed it to another state trooper who had been at the scene the day of the murders. He said it looked accurate. Some of the specifics were wrong, but the route to the murder scene and the position of the bodies seemed to be correct.
As DeFalco drove back to the state police headquarters, she continued to puzzle over the map. It could have been the ravings of a madman, but it was hard to believe that Franklin just happened to get so many of the details right. She figured there was only one way to find out. She had to speak with Franklin herself. This is our final episode on the murders of Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero, who were killed on their way to a peace festival called the Rainbow Gathering. Last week, we covered the first 4 years of the investigation, when detectives placed all of their focus on a few local men. This week, we'll cover the serial killer who inserted himself into the case and the confusing conviction that followed.
We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us.
"1983 was an exciting time for 33-year-old Robert Alkire. After 3 frustrating years, the West Virginia State Trooper finally seemed to be making headway on the Rainbow murders. He worked tirelessly on the case all through that year, following lead after lead and arresting a total of 3 suspects.
But by February 1984, it had all fallen apart. The men were all released from jail, and soon enough, Alkire was transferred to another city to work on a new murder case. It may have looked like an admission of defeat.
But even as Alkire set up his office on the other side of the state, he found it impossible to forget about 26-year-old Vicky Durian and 19-year-old Nancy Santomero. He continued to look into previous leads and kept himself on high alert for any new information about the case.
In her book, The Third Rainbow Girl, author Emma Copley Eisenberg described one of Alkire's theories about the murder. He often told other officers and deputies that he believed the culprit was a Pocahontas County local because the women had been killed in an extremely remote area. He'd made this connection in the first few days of the investigation, and in 4 years he hadn't wavered. But in March 1984, he received a phone call that called that theory into question.
Hi, I'm calling from the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation. Our team is actually at the federal penitentiary a few states over and just finished speaking to one of the inmates. He mentioned some stuff that you might want to know. Does the name Joseph Paul Franklin mean anything to you?
It's pretty likely that Robert Alkire had heard of him. Joseph Paul Franklin was a white supremacist serial killer who had committed dozens of hate crimes up and down the East Coast in the late 1970s. When he was finally arrested in October 1980, the story made national headlines.
Franklin was born under a different name, James Clayton Vaughn, and grew up in Mobile, Alabama. His father deserted the family when he was 8, and his alcoholic mother beat him and his siblings almost every day. By the time he reached high school, the boy had multiple skull fractures and was blind in one eye.
Vaughn's cognitive impairment made school difficult, and according to a 2001 biography, he skipped class constantly. The author, Mel Ayton, described him escaping into fantasy stories and said that fairy tales and westerns were his favorites. In high school, he became obsessed with religion and compulsively read the Bible and other spiritual texts.
Around the same time, in the mid-1960s, Alabama became a battleground for the national civil rights movement. Vaughn watched as activists and political organizers demanded an end to segregation, and like many other white Southerners, he refused to listen.
When his high school was desegregated in 1965, 15-year-old Vaughn was sickened by the sight of black teenagers sitting next to him in class. He delved deeper into the writings of white supremacist Christian sects, and when he was 17, he stole a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf from the Mobile Public Library.
Soon after that, he dropped out of high school and joined the American Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan. He became convinced that Jewish people were conspiring with black Americans to take over the country, and in order to stop this impending race war, he needed to take matters into his own hands.
In 1973, James Clayton Vaughn changed his name. He started calling himself Joseph Paul, after Nazi propagandists Paul Joseph Goebbels, and Franklin after Benjamin Franklin. He'd fantasized about murdering black and Jewish people for years. Now, with this new identity, he seemed ready to bring those bloody thoughts to fruition.
His crime spree started in July 1977, when he bombed the home of a pro-Israel politician. Just days later, 27-year-old Franklin planted explosives inside an Orthodox synagogue in Tennessee. The following week, he killed his first victims, an interracial couple. 2 months later, he hid in the bushes outside a St. Louis synagogue and fired on worshipers as they left the temple.
He continued to roam the country like this for 3 years, living off of bank robberies and blood plasma donations.
Franklin attacked at least 2 more interracial couples and allegedly attempted to assassinate Vernon Jordan, a prominent civil rights activist. He also reportedly ambushed Larry Flynt, the publisher of Hustler magazine, because one edition depicted interracial sex.
In 1980, the 30-year-old's crimes reached a fever pitch. Within 2 months, he shot 2 black children in Cincinnati, murdered a mixed-race couple in Pennsylvania, and killed 2 black joggers in Salt Lake City.
By this point, law enforcement departments across the country had connected the attacks. They knew that the killer visited blood banks frequently and had a prominent tattoo of the Grim Reaper on his right arm, so they issued a nationwide alert.
In October of 1980, an employee at a Florida blood bank quietly recognized the menacing tattoo as Franklin rolled up his sleeve. The FBI was called, and Franklin was arrested soon after. He would ultimately receive 2 life sentences.
Franklin was imprisoned at a federal facility in Illinois. Even though he had confessed to a few crimes, no one knew how many murders he'd actually committed in those 3 years. He became a prime suspect in just about every unsolved murder that fit his modus operandi between 1977 and 1980.
Investigators from across the country clamored to speak with him, including special agents from Wisconsin. They wanted to know if he'd killed a female hitchhiker whose body had been left in a state park. And to their surprise, he admitted to it instantly.
Oh, right. She was heading home from college, I think. Picked her up on the side of the road. After a few miles, I asked if she had a boyfriend, and she said she'd dated some Jamaican kid. Tossed her out and killed her right there. That was, May 1980, I think. All those girl hitchhikers are commies or race mixers. Easy to kill, too. I took out 2 more of them in West Virginia a few weeks after.
The Wisconsin agent pressed for more details. Franklin said that he was on his way from North Carolina to Kentucky on June 25, 1980. He saw 2 white female hitchhikers on the side of the road. They had a scruffy look to them. They looked like hippies.
The girls climbed into Franklin's car and told him they were headed to some kind of rainbow festival. He drove them for a few hours, only stopping once to fill up on gas. Naturally, the 3 of them got to talking. As the conversation went on, Franklin started to suspect that they were communists and that they hung around with, or maybe even dated, black men. In his mind, this was reason enough to kill them.
Franklin claimed that he ordered the girls to get out of the car once they got to a remote area. Then he shot them point blank and left their bodies on the side of the road.
At first, the agent was skeptical of this confession. Franklin was already in prison for life, so it was no skin off his back to confess to a crime he didn't commit. He could be making this up to attract attention from the press or boost his number of alleged victims.
The agent gave Franklin a pen and paper and asked him to draw the area where he'd supposedly killed these girls. Then he called the West Virginia authorities.
State Trooper Robert Alkire listened to everything the Wisconsin agent had to say. When the story was done, he gave the man a courteous thank you and ended the call.
Alkire was sure that an outsider like Franklin couldn't have actually committed the Rainbow murders. Vicky and Nancy had been killed on the face of a small mountain called Briery Knob. It was almost impossible to imagine a random drifter getting up there on his own.
The investigation was still focused on local men like Gerald Brown, Bobby Lee Morrison, and Jacob Beard. It sounded like Franklin had picked up all these details from news stories about the murders and made up the story to spook the Wisconsin agents. Alkire disregarded the tip and went on with his day.
But the Wisconsin officer was insistent. He faxed the hand-drawn map to Alkire's office a few days later. To Alkire, it looked nothing like Pocahontas County, and it didn't seem to match the details of the case either.
The gas station was drawn on the wrong side of the road, and Franklin had written Rainbow Meeting instead of Rainbow Gathering. He made it look like Vicky and Nancy were killed close to the interstate, when they were actually several miles away. And in his most glaring mistake, he referred to the area as Beckley County, which didn't even exist. Alkire put the map out of his mind.
But then, a few months later, his office got another call. Franklin had brought up the Rainbow murders again, this time in an interview with authorities from Tennessee.
Even though the West Virginia state troopers remained skeptical of Franklin, they felt like they had to follow this lead. In August 1984, a captain assigned Debbie DeFalco to the case.
DeFalco assumed that this would be yet another dead end, but after she showed the map to a local officer in Pocahontas County, she started to reconsider.
The more she thought about it, the more Franklin made sense as a suspect. In addition to the map, the inmate had drawn a picture of the bullet he supposedly used. It was a large one, 240 grain.
DeFalco called the ballistics lab. They confirmed that Vicky and Nancy could have been killed by a bullet that size.
And when she looked through the old case records, DeFalco was reminded that a general store cashier had allegedly seen Vicky and Nancy right before they died. According to this woman, the girls were traveling with a tall, blonde man who drove a dark-colored Chevy Nova.
The state trooper started contacting other agencies that were investigating Franklin, trying to figure out if he matched the cashier's description. An agent in Pennsylvania told her that as far as they knew, Franklin had short blonde hair at the time.
DeFalco was able to confirm that Franklin had robbed a bank in North Carolina the day before the Rainbow murders. A young boy had actually seen him climb into a black car when he was fleeing the scene. According to North Carolina authorities, it was a Nova.
By this point, DeFalco was pretty sure that Joseph Paul Franklin didn't make this story up. In fact, there seemed to be more evidence against him than there had ever been against Jacob Beard or Gerald Brown. But in order to really be certain, she needed to talk to Franklin.
In early October 1984, the warden finally allowed her to make an appointment. She drove 9 hours to the federal penitentiary and came face to face with Franklin in a cramped, square room.
Debbie DeFalco's recollections of this meeting are described in detail in The Third Rainbow Girl. According to her, the 34-year-old inmate arrived in shackles. He wouldn't stop staring at her through his one good eye. DeFalco remembered glancing at her notepad, trying to maintain composure.
She sat across from him for more than an hour, asking question after question, but he flatly dismissed everything. He even denied robbing the bank in North Carolina.
DeFalco called the guards in, and they ushered Franklin back into a cell outside of the interrogation room. But then, as the state trooper was leaving, Franklin motioned to get her attention. He beckoned her to come closer, then whispered in her ear.
Let me put your mind at ease. I did it.
Debbie DeFalco listened intently. She leaned in and asked him for more details, like how he got rid of the women's backpacks.
Easy. When I was heading back toward the interstate, I dumped him in the forest. Made sure no one could see him from the road, though. One of them was green, which made things a little easier.
DeFalco made a mental note of this. Vicky Durian had been carrying a green bag. Then Franklin leaned in once more to give her a final message.
It breaks my heart to think of someone else sitting in prison for something I did. Promise me you won't put him there.
DeFalco told the author that she sped home to West Virginia and spent the next few months delving even deeper into the case. She talked to even more law enforcement agencies and compiled the evidence against Franklin in a comprehensive report.
In March 1985, she presented everything to Robert Alkire and the other higher-ups. Her report concluded with a clear statement. Joseph Paul Franklin had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit the Rainbow murders. It was entirely possible that he was the killer they'd been looking for.
But despite all the evidence that DeFalco presented, Alkire and his colleagues didn't buy it. They hardly even entertained it.
This may have been because Alkire still thought the killer had to be local. Even though DeFalco presented plenty of reasons to suspect Franklin, the serial killer was an outsider. He didn't fit the most basic criteria for a suspect and should be ignored.
But the idea that the killer was from Pocahontas County was just that, an idea. As far as we know, there wasn't any hard evidence to back it up. It's possible that the state troopers had some information that we're not privy to, but it's also possible that the case was being swayed by an old assumption.
All we know for sure is that after 7 months of investigation, Debbie DeFalco's work went down the drain.
But she found it impossible to forget Joseph Paul Franklin. This was partially because of the strength of his case, and partially because somehow the serial killer got a hold of her home phone number.
He called her multiple times over the next few years. In their first conversation, he admitted that he'd lied in their initial interview. He did rob that bank in North Carolina.
DeFalco probably wasn't that surprised, but she likely wondered what else he'd been lying about. Did Franklin actually know what happened to the Rainbow Girls? Sadly, she was still years from discovering the truth.
Coming up, the West Virginia State Troopers try to track down one local suspect and end up with 7 of them. In the summer of 1990, Pocahontas County faced a grim anniversary. It had been a full decade since the Rainbow murders, and still, the residents had no idea who was responsible. Suspects and theories had come and gone, but again and again, new leads froze into dead ends. It seemed like they'd never get an answer.
But then, in the winter of 1991, a sheriff's deputy stumbled on a new clue. They found a handwritten note in the office, dated 1986.
The note was written in cryptic shorthand, like someone had jotted it down while on the phone.
Alice Roberts seen Ricky Fowler pick the girls up at Rennick Valley. Jake Beard blue car. Huh.
It looked like someone named Alice Roberts had seen the Rainbow Girls in an area called Rennick, just south of the crime scene. According to her, a man named Richard Ricky Fowler had given them a ride. And of course, Jacob Beard had something to do with it too. His name seemed to show up anywhere the case was mentioned.
The tip had come in a full year after the Joseph Paul Franklin debacle, when the case was sitting dormant. But as far as the deputy could tell, no one had followed up on it. The fact that the sheriff's office overlooked a piece of evidence in the county's most high-profile cold case was shocking in and of itself. And now, at least half a decade had passed since the tip came in.
Needless to say, the deputy jumped into action. They worked with Robert Alkire to track down Alice Roberts. She had a vague memory of calling in the tip, but said that her daughter Pamela Wilson was the actual first-hand witness.
Pamela lived right next to the state highway. On June 25, 1980, she didn't have much to do. She ended up staring out the window at the neat lines of cars zooming by. But then something strange happened.
Sometime in the afternoon, between 2 and 6 p.m., Pamela saw two female hitchhikers standing on the side of the road. A local man, Richard Fowler, pulled up next to them. Pamela recognized his distinctive blue van.
In less than a minute, the young women climbed into Fowler's van. Then he sped off toward Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park. She also thought she recognized two other men riding along with him, Winters Walton and Bill McCoy, but she couldn't be sure.
Alkire recognized the name Bill McCoy. Jacob Beard said that he saw McCoy up at Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park a few hours before the murders. And looking back at his notes, it looked like Richard Fowler might have been up there too.
Suddenly, the case started picking up steam again. Alkire and the sheriff's deputies re-interviewed dozens of possible witnesses and suspects throughout the winter of 1991.
Strangely enough, many Pocahontas County residents offered up new, highly relevant information that they hadn't mentioned the first time around. Almost all of them included some combination of Richard Fowler, Gerald Brown, and Jacob Beard.
So you saw Richard Fowler's van next to Gerald Brown's trailer on the night the girls were killed. Right. See anyone else there? No? Got it. Only reason I ask is that someone else told Sergeant Alkire he saw Bill McCoy and Jake Beard up there too. But you didn't see him. All right. Thank you kindly.
Let me make sure I've got this right. You were driving past Droop Mountain around 5:30. Might have been 6? Okay, around 5:30 or 6 on June 25th. And you saw Jacob Beard's red truck out by the entrance? Interesting.
And what time did you see Jake Beard driving out of the state park? Late afternoon. Okay. And this was June 25th, 1980? Got it, sir. We'll call you up if we have any more questions.
Fowler told you he'd seen the Rainbow Girls die?
The investigators' heads were spinning with all this new information. They didn't understand why these people waited so long to share these tips. But the witnesses all said they kept quiet for the same reason. Allegedly, they were afraid of retaliation from Jacob Beard.
But the investigators couldn't be sure that these stories were true. The case had been thrown off course by false statements in the past, and it just seemed strange that these witnesses waited a full decade to come forward.
Nevertheless, Alkire and his team kept going, and by the spring of 1992, they had a completely new theory about what happened to Vicky and Nancy.
They felt fairly certain that Fowler, McCoy, and Walton picked up the girls on the side of the highway, as Pamela Wilson claimed. Then, the men drove up to Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park, where they hung around with Vicky and Nancy in the afternoon.
They called up some friends, and by early evening, at least 7 men were gathered near the park entrance. 5 of them had already been investigated: Richard Fowler, Bill McCoy, Jacob Beard, Gerald Brown, and Arnold Cutlip.
The other 2 men were Johnny Lewis and Winters Walton, who hadn't been looked into yet. The state troopers thought that this group of 7 men partied with Vicky and Nancy for a few hours. At some point, one of them pulled out a gun and shot them. Later, they would speculate that this was because the women denied one of the men's sexual advances.
But they still didn't know who pulled the trigger.
Even though this was a loose theory, it seemed more believable than any that had come before. The witness testimony seemed dubious, but the sheer amount of it couldn't be ignored. Robert Alkire continued to interview Pocahontas County residents. He wanted to hone in on who did the shooting before he called any of the suspects in for questioning.
But word traveled fast, and soon enough, one of the suspects called Alkire's office to chew him out. It was 40-year-old Richard Fowler.
You'd have to be a real idiot to think I had anything to do with that. I wasn't even living in the state when those murders happened. I was in Virginia and only came back to Pocahontas County on weekends. Last I checked, June 25th, 1980 was a Wednesday. Case closed, officer.
Fowler clearly didn't want to cooperate, but Alkire tried to get as much information out of him as possible. He asked about the blue van, hoping to pull a paint sample, but it turned out that Fowler had sent it to the scrapyard in 1986.
Alkire did get a small victory from the phone call, though. He convinced Fowler to travel to West Virginia and sit down for a full interview. When they finally met in person, some of the suspects' confidence had faded.
I mean, it was a long time ago. I was out of town pretty much every weekend. But maybe I had the day off or something. I was drinking a lot back then, and a whole lot of days just sort of slipped through the cracks. Maybe I let some friend take the van up there. I don't know.
When Alkire asked Fowler to elaborate, the suspect stood up and left. He also refused to take a polygraph test and hired a lawyer soon after.
After he spoke with Fowler, Alkire started contacting the other suspects directly. First on his list was 50-year-old Gerald Brown, who he'd been suspicious of for years. Brown had failed to provide any sort of alibi when he was originally interrogated in 1983.
Now, in 1992, it didn't seem like much had changed. Brown completely refused to answer Alkire's questions. Without enough evidence to charge him with anything, the state trooper was forced to move on.
Next was Bill McCoy, but it looked like he was in prison somewhere in Nevada. Alkire tried to get in touch with him, but McCoy didn't return any of his calls. There wasn't enough evidence against him to put out a warrant, so Alkire had to move on.
The state trooper easily got in contact with 54-year-old Arnold Cutlip. This would be the 3rd time that Cutlip was investigated, and his alibi in 1992 was almost identical to the one he gave in 1980. But one detail might have been new.
Okay, I'll lay it out for you one more time. Me and Johnny Lewis spent the morning cutting wood near my trailer. We made a couple fence posts and drove to a farm near Marlington so we could sell them in the afternoon. Then we had a couple beers at a bar in Hillsboro and followed Palmer and Christine up to the state park. And before you ask, I did not see those girls up there. Ask Johnny. He'll tell you the same thing.
Alkire might have been surprised to hear Cutlip bring up his trip to Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park. Jacob Beard said he'd seen Christine Cook, Palmer Adkisson, and others in the area, but Alkire didn't believe him at the time. However, maybe Beard had been telling the truth all along.
Other than that, Arnold Cutlip's alibi was consistent, but Alkire wanted to check his story with the man he said he was with all day, Johnny Lewis, who also happened to be a suspect in the case.
59-year-old Johnny Lewis had a distinct reputation around town. He was a drifter who had dropped out of school in the 3rd grade. He relied on the kindness of friends and neighbors to keep a roof over his head. He was soft-spoken and shy.
The state trooper had a quick conversation with Lewis. He was certain he'd been with Cutlip all day.
Now Alkire had 2 more suspects to check in with, 42-year-old Winters Walton and 46-year-old Jacob Beard. He knew that Beard had moved to Florida with his family. The distance, coupled with the strained history between the men, was enough to convince Alkire to put Beard's case aside.
So he moved on to the final man on the list, Winters Walton. He'd already admitted that he'd been riding around with Richard Fowler and Bill McCoy on the day of the murders, but he insisted that they hadn't picked up any girls.
Walton agreed to take a polygraph test in the early months of 1992. Alkire called in a colleague from the state police office, Sergeant R.D. Estep, to administer it. The state trooper sat silently as Walton repeated his story.
Walton gave Estep the same alibi he told Alkire, but the sergeant didn't believe it. He insisted that Walton was trying to deceive him for reasons that are still unknown, and just then, Alkire stood up and left the room.
We don't know exactly what happened between Walton and Estep. Here's what we can verify. They were locked in the interrogation room together for almost an hour, and about a week after their meeting, Walton called the state police office and said he had new information to share. He didn't give specifics.
We can only speculate on what happened between Sergeant Estep and Winters Walton during that polygraph test and why he changed his statement. But later allegations from Walton could indicate that he was intimidated by the authorities.
Walton later told his lawyer that on April 15, 1992, Estep showed up at his workplace and told him he needed to come in for another interview. At first, this seemed like Estep was giving Walton the simple opportunity to share information that he'd promised.
But as soon as Walton got into the car, things went south. Walton later testified to these events in court. According to Walton, the sergeant pulled over, climbed into the back seat, and verbally threatened him.
Walton also said that Estep slapped him, damaging his glasses. Then they started heading towards the police station, but according to his testimony, the abuse didn't stop there.
The suspect told the court that Estep pushed him off of his chair. He said he would kick Walton's head through the door if he didn't get the information he wanted.
Walton claimed that he panicked and said the first name that came to mind. He thought Jacob Beard did it, maybe.
After he said that name, Estep allegedly calmed down. He opened the door and called Robert Alkire in. He said Walton was finally ready to talk.
Now, these are some pretty explosive allegations of police intimidation and misconduct. While Walton's perspective should definitely be considered, we should note that Estep testified as well. He denied that any of these events happened. The court also failed to find any factual evidence to back up Walton's claims.
Things got a little more straightforward after Alkire entered the room. For whatever reason, Walton had changed his tune. He told the state trooper that he remembered the Rainbow murders.
But there was a catch. He wasn't sure if he'd witnessed them firsthand, or if he just had a vivid dream.
And he waffled back and forth on who the killer was. After several hours of questioning, he broke down and said Jacob Beard was the culprit.
The state troopers typed up Winters Walton's testimony, and he signed it. But because he was allegedly intimidated before and during the interview, his story should definitely be taken with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only suspect who was allegedly treated this way.
Johnny Lewis was also brought to the station that day. At first, he gave the same alibi he'd relied on for more than a decade. He'd been out cutting posts with Arnold Cutlip all day, simple as that.
But then, Sergeant Estep entered the room. Lewis would later testify in court that Estep held up a pair of metal handcuffs and almost hit him in the face.
According to Robert Alkire's report, the next day, Lewis came back to the police station. He said he actually did see someone shoot Vicky Durian and Nancy Santamero. It was Jacob Beard.
Lewis also stated that Gerald Brown, Arnold Cutlip, Bill McCoy, and Richard Fowler were all at the scene. Oddly enough, he didn't say that Winters Walton was there, even though Walton also claimed to see the murder.
But it seems very strange that they changed their stories at almost the exact same time.
Not to mention the fact that their new versions of events just happened to indict Brown, Cutlip, McCoy, Fowler, and Beard, the same suspects that the police were already looking into.
Even though the statements seem dubious in hindsight, the state troopers continued to move forward. After Lewis signed his statement, they arrested all 7 of the men involved.
Brown, Cutlip, Lewis, and Walton were each charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and sent to the Pocahontas County Jail. Fowler, McCoy, and Beard were all out of state, so Al Kyer and his team sent out warrants.
Soon enough, all 7 men were behind bars. This wave of arrests sent a clear message. The state troopers were going to close this case, and it seemed like they wouldn't let anything get in their way.
But these choices would come back to haunt them. And so would an old suspect.
Coming up, the local men are finally given a trial, and Joseph Paul Franklin starts talking again.
And now, back to our story.
In the spring of 1992, 7 men were arrested, more or less simultaneously, in connection to the Rainbow murders. According to journalist Emma Copley Eisenberg, the media descended upon Pocahontas County. The story seemed irresistible.
A sensational cold case finally solved. 2 naive young hitchhikers, a hippie festival, a swarm of local men with bad intentions, and finally, the brave state troopers who tracked them down.
In the first few months after the arrests, multiple national news outlets regurgitated this narrative. Many of the journalists who wrote these stories left the county and moved on to the next assignment.
But as the legal cases developed, it became clear that the story of the Rainbow murders was much more complicated.
The state's case against 46-year-old Jacob Beard and his supposed accomplices hit its first speed bump in June of 1992, and it was a big one.
In a pre-trial interview, Johnny Lewis recanted his statement against the other men. He doubled down on his original story, that he was with Arnold Cutlip all day.
And Winters Walton told another police officer that Sergeant Estep had threatened him. Without these 2 key witnesses, the case fell apart. The county prosecutor dropped all charges in mid-July 1992, and the men were all released on bail.
But even though the men were free, Robert Alkire refused to let go of the case. He spent a few more months reworking his strategy. Then, sometime in the fall of 1992, he approached Lewis and Walton again to ask them for one more interview. But this interview wouldn't be like the ones before. Al Kyer wanted them to answer all the same questions, under hypnosis.
Both men agreed to this for reasons that are still unknown. Hypnosis was already seen as a pseudoscience and was known to make people more suggestible.
Even though both men had recanted their stories about seeing Jacob Beard shoot Vicky and Nancy, they miraculously recovered these memories under hypnosis. At least one of them didn't have a lawyer present when this happened.
Lewis and Walton's testimonies seemed remarkably unreliable, but still, County Prosecutor Walt Wyford decided to run with this new information.
He reinstated the murder charges against Jacob Beard, Gerald Brown, Arnold Cutlip, Richard Fowler, and Bill McCoy. Lewis and Walton were given immunity, but kept in jail.
The prosecution team continued to prepare their case throughout the winter of 1992. Then, yet another wrench was thrown in.
One of the suspects, Gerald Brown, died during the brief period he was out of prison. This was after Walton and Lewis were hypnotized, but before he could be arrested. According to medical examiners, his death had nothing to do with the upcoming trial. He'd choked on a sandwich after a night out drinking.
So now the group of 7 had been whittled down to 4, and only one of them, Jacob Beard, had a court date. His trial started on May 19th, 1993.
First, the prosecutor laid out how he thought Vicky and Nancy were killed. It was similar to the story that had come out of Pamela Wilson's tip. The young women were picked up, most likely by Richard Fowler, and taken up to Droop Mountain Battlefield State Park.
More men joined in and partied for a few hours. They tried to get the women to sleep with them, and the women refused. The men might have attempted to forcibly assault them. The women resisted and said they'd tell the police. The prosecutor continued.
Shortly after these comments were made by these young women, and really for reasons that may never be clear, absolutely be clear to anybody, perhaps out of anger, perhaps out of ridicule, frustration, for whatever purpose, and it would have been a senseless purpose, this defendant, Jake Beard, obtained a gun and shot both girls dead.
Wyford went on to acknowledge some of the issues with this case. There was hardly any physical evidence, and the lead witnesses were Johnny Lewis and Winters Walton, who had given conflicting stories multiple times. But if the jury kept up with the details, it would all make sense in the end.
Then Jacob Beard's lawyer pointed out everything that had gone wrong in this investigation. From his point of view, Beard had been a target ever since he made that phone call in 1982. But outside of that phone call, there was nothing concrete to tie him to the murders.
It seemed like a weak argument, but in reality it was a last-ditch effort. The defense had planned to build their case around Joseph Paul Franklin's confession from 1984. They even wanted to bring Franklin in to testify in person.
But right when the trial started, the county prosecutor filed a motion to ban any discussion of him. The judge agreed and only allowed the defense to mention Franklin in extremely broad terms.
Jacob Beard remained mostly quiet throughout the 12-day trial. He'd briefly testified in his own defense and repeated the same alibi he'd given in 1982, the first time he was interviewed.
He said he'd been working at the tractor shop on the day of the murders, then went on a house call. He ran a quick errand and stopped at home before heading to a school board meeting. There was no mention of Droop Mountain, corn choppers, or rainbow girls.
Beard also claimed that the men he'd been arrested with were little more than acquaintances. He'd only met Winters Walton in the last month.
The defendant ended his cross-examination with an unequivocal statement. He absolutely did not kill those women.
But Beard's words didn't do much to sway the jury. Because the pre-trial motion had blocked any discussion of Joseph Paul Franklin, the defense's case was essentially gutted before the trial began. It wasn't a surprise when they handed over their verdict.
The jury found Jacob Beard guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Jacob Beard was sent to prison in the summer of 1993, when he was around 47 years old. By 1994, his legal team had submitted his case to the Court of Appeals. They cited multiple issues in the original trial, including the use of hypnosis and the judge's choice to ban any evidence related to Joseph Paul Franklin.
This first appeal was eventually denied. Beard's case seemed to be going nowhere. But then in October of that year, an otherworldly presence intervened.
According to Joseph Paul Franklin, a so-called spirit guide came to him with a message. Even though he'd been behind bars for 14 years and would be spending his life in jail no matter what, he should confess to more of his crimes, including the ones that carried the death penalty.
Franklin contacted the FBI. He admitted to killing a man who was exiting a synagogue in St. Louis, Missouri. Detectives across the country heard about this new confession and clamored to ask him about their unsolved cases.
A prosecutor from Cincinnati visited him in 1997 to ask about the murders of 2 black boys. Franklin wasted no time in saying that he killed them, but then he steered the conversation toward the Rainbow murders in West Virginia. Even though the case was out of her jurisdiction, the investigator pressed him for more specifics.
During her research, Eisenberg found a transcript of the conversation.
Did you get any emotional satisfaction out of killing either one of those girls or both of the girls?
What do you mean?
Was there any emotional... I guess, what was your feeling afterwards or during?
I'm not really sure, you know. It's not that you get emotional satisfaction. It's just that you know, it's someone you think should be wasted. So I just went ahead and wasted them, you know. To me, it was just something I had to do. It's a nasty job, but somebody had to do it.
Can you see their faces in your mind? Can you see them?
Basically, yeah. I can see them.
Franklin repeated a lot of the details that Debbie DeFalco had uncovered in 1984. He said he was driving a Chevy Nova and had stopped at a convenience store on the way up the mountain. He described the women as, quote, dirty hippie-type broads, and he said he'd killed them because they might have dated black men.
But there were still some details that didn't match the facts of the case. Most glaringly, Franklin said he'd shot the women inside of his car. According to the ballistics experts who examined the bodies, this wasn't possible. There would have been way more gunpowder residue on them if they were shot at such close range.
But whether Franklin was the actual culprit or not, his confession opened up a new angle for Jacob Beard and his defense team.
They filed a motion for a new trial in 1997. The judge was hesitant. In order to grant a new trial, he needed new evidence. And because Franklin had already given all of this information to Debbie DeFalco, he wasn't sure it met that criteria.
But the defense was fairly certain that they could get something new. Franklin had not participated in the previous trial. Now that he was talking again, he might be willing to testify too.
The only way to find out was to talk to him, so in November of 1998, the lawyer packed up his things and headed to Missouri, where Franklin was being held. A crew from CBS News tagged along, eager to get the deposition on tape.
And they didn't have to work very hard to get it. Even with multiple cameras in his face, Joseph Paul Franklin didn't hesitate to say that he did it.
The CBS broadcast brought national attention to the case, and soon enough, the judge granted 50-year-old Jacob Beard a new trial. The court date was set for May 2000. Robert Alkire re-interviewed everyone involved.
The testimonies were almost identical to the ones from 1994, with two major additions. The first was Franklin's deposition, in which he plainly stated that he committed the murders.
And the second was a new witness, a psychologist who had reviewed Johnny Lewis and Winters Walton's flip-flopping testimonies. She told the jury that these men's claims about repressed memories had little to no scientific backing, and that their stories should have been treated with more skepticism.
Both sides delivered their closing arguments on May 31st. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. In the end, they decided that there just wasn't enough evidence against Jacob Beard. He was found not guilty.
After 20 years, countless suspects, and one conviction, the Rainbow murders were once again considered unsolved. And they've remained that way.
When journalist Emma Copley Eisenberg spoke with residents of Pocahontas County, many of them still believe that Jacob Beard killed the Rainbow Girls.
But she also spoke to Beard himself. He insisted that none of the local men were involved, and that it was probably Joseph Paul Franklin who did it.
According to Eisenberg's book, Debbie DeFalco agrees. She told Eisenberg that Beard had made multiple mistakes, starting with a call to Vicki Durian's family in 1982. But at the end of the day, his case had no hard evidence. At least 2 of the witnesses who testified against him alleged that they were coached or intimidated into speaking. And besides, he had no real motive.
Franklin, on the other hand, did have a possible motive, a deep and twisted belief in white supremacy, and a hatred of what he referred to as race mixers. And from DeFalco's point of view, there was plenty of evidence against Franklin, from the bullet he drew on the map to the car that he was driving.
Joseph Paul Franklin was executed in 2013 at age 63. While he was never formally tried for the Rainbow murders, he also never retracted his confession. Many sources, including a 2011 biography by Mel Ayton, state that he killed Vicky and Nancy outright.
But there are still certain details in the case against Franklin that don't add up. Perhaps if the investigation had been more organized, or if Franklin was willing to speak with authorities earlier, some of these discrepancies would have been cleared up. But at this point, it seems like we'll never know.
What we do know is this. Whoever killed Vicky Durian and Nancy Santamero ended the lives of two bright, adventurous young women. The two of them had come to West Virginia looking for peace, love, and a place to belong. That makes it even more sickening to imagine the way their journey ended, in fear, violence, and hatred.